Make no mistake about it. I don't want a man in here to go back home thinking otherwise. We are going to win.
But the war was developing rapidly on all fronts. And as the number of casualties mounted, it began to highlight the divisions in US society.
There's another aspect to the war in Vietnam, which is race. This was the first time there was a major commitment of mixed race units. A lot of young black Americans wanted to prove their status in American society, their manhood, if you will. He wanted to get young black men into the army so he could supply proper medical assistance to them, give them education, and get them out of the ghettos and improve their lot. As the war started to go badly, the black guys said, well, hold on, why are we dying over here when the enemy's back home in America?
In the early years of the war, the black and Latin American soldiers were military professionals in mostly mixed-race units. But by the end of 1968, draftees accounted for over 30% of American troops. Among them were many black soldiers who, having endured racial prejudice at home, were growing increasingly disaffected by what they called the white man's war. As the casualty rate increased, conscription also began to include college students who had previously been exempt. While the majority of US soldiers were still volunteers, their ranks now included middle-class white Americans who had been forced to defer their university education.
When I first went out there in '68, the majority of the infantrymen were all working-class Americans. But when the Americans abandoned this avoidance of the draft, and suddenly in Vietnam, we saw the arrival not of the officer class, but of white middle-class kids in the ranks.
These are young men who have to go and fight, and the draft comes in, and so you may have to fight against your will. And then the whole idea of the draft dodger comes in.
Well, it wasn't the fact so much that they were university students, it was the middle class. The middle class was getting drafted. Not a chance. Forget it, which is why there hasn't been a draft since then. World War II draft was, I mean, everybody believed in the war.
You suddenly had middle-class kids being drafted in to do the same job. And they were writing letters home. Their parents were appealing to their congressmen. And that's when it all started to change.
Giant protests were not even so much the soldiers as their mothers. Because what the hell is my boy doing in Vietnam? Hey, he should be doing his graduate work now. Well, you could get a student deferment for a while, but the middle class was getting drafted, which you can make a coherent theory, saying that that's why we lost the war.
They're only going there for a year tour, whereas the Vietnamese fighters are there all the time. So every time you send a fresh young guy who's just come out of college, they have to start again with a new guy who knows nothing.
All the challenges have been met. The enemy is not beaten, but he knows that he has met his master in the field.